Well, we certainly are glad to see you. Honored to be with you tonight, and appreciate so much those who have chosen to join us and visit with us this evening. I know the church here appreciates your encouragement, and I'm sure you didn't come for the famous preacher tonight, but I'm encouraged anyway. I'm glad you're here. And I'm thankful for the time we've had to study these things. It's so good for me to think about them, and I appreciate your kind reaction to them and your questions and your comments. Means a lot, and I encourage you to continue. If you have a question about something we've said, please feel free to talk with me about that, and I do appreciate it. We've been talking about the wisdom literature. We spent a lot of Sunday talking about Proverbs, just a lesson or two really from Proverbs. We spent the last 3 lessons talking about Job, and tonight and tomorrow night we'll conclude the meeting with some thoughts about Ecclesiastes. Would you think less of me if I told you Ecclesiastes is probably my favorite book of the Old Testament? I don't know that I ought to have a favorite. It's just top 39, as the guy said. But I love Ecclesiastes. And when you say that, people look at you funny, because sometimes, at least, some people maybe don't have the best relationship with this book. And there are those who think, well, that's such a dark book. You know, talking about the meaningless of life, and that seems so dark and so pessimistic. And what I would say to somebody like that, without being flippant, but I just say keep reading. It doesn't end that way. Sometimes people struggle with the book itself because they say, well, it seems to be sometimes contradictory. And you'll have sometimes where he talks about rejoicing, and then he'll talk about it's all vanity, and how do you... And of course, I think the answer to that, and it's critical that I understand this, is that both of those things are true. It just depends on which path you're on. Those are 2 destinations, but they're 2 different roads. And so he's talking really about a choice that we have to make about how we live our life. And the reason why I love this book is because it is, like all truth, it is so relevant. We sometimes think about first principles lessons and first principles text. Ecclesiastes is first principles. This is really where we live. This gets as basic as it can. And I can't think of any generation in my lifetime, any time in my lifetime, where this message was more needed by the world today. Young people and old people. And so I'm excited about being able to think with you about this book. And those of you who are students of this book and have studied it for years, I hope this will be a helpful reminder. And for some young folks who may not be as familiar with this book, I hope you'll come away with a great appreciation for how and what a blessing it is. It begins with the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, saith the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What profit hath a man of all his labor, which he takes under the sun? The title of this lesson comes from the Greek Old Testament. And Ecclesiastes may seem quite foreign to us, but if you just hold your finger over the last half of that word, we know ecclesia, don't we? We don't have to be Greek scholars to have heard that word. That's the word in the New Testament so often translated church. And we know the basic idea of that word, to kallo, to call, ek out, to call out. And that's the image, isn't it? The church is the called out. Well, the Ecclesiastes is the one who may do the calling. To call people to him, to come and sit at his feet. The koheleth in the Hebrew. The preacher in the English Bibles. This is a book in which a wise man calls us to come and learn from him. And I believe that the wise man here is Solomon. There are some smart fellows, smarter than I am, who disagree with that. But I'm just convinced. This is either Solomon or it's somebody who wants us to think it's Solomon. And I just don't think God works through frauds. I don't believe. There are some books that we might value, or some people might value for a particular purpose, that claim to be written by Baruch or written by Moses, but they're not. And everybody knows they're not. And they put them in the pseudepigrapha or some other collection like that. And maybe they have a value, but they don't belong in the canon. And I think Ecclesiastes belongs in the canon. It's genuine. This is the son of David. This is the king in Jerusalem. And the relevance of that to me is, again, what that would say to me is that this is the repentance of Solomon. This is Solomon late in his life, looking back on the years he spent out of duty, and we all know he did spend years out of duty, in which he got away from God and made a lot of bad choices and took a lot of roads he should have known better than. What was it he said in the 2nd chapter in verse 12? I turned myself to behold wisdom and madness and folly, for what can a man do that comes after the king, even that which hath already been done? And I think this book represents the repentance of Solomon. And late in his life, he writes by inspiration, and he says to us as readers, look, I've made a lot of mistakes in life. I've taken a lot of dead-end roads. And if you will listen to me, you can save yourself a lot of heartache and a lot of trouble. And so that's the greatness of this book. It really is there to help us to avoid a lot of tears and a lot of suffering in life. It's a very practical work. It deals with life under the sun. That's a key phrase. I think it's used 27 times in the book. I think it's found in 9 of the 12 chapters at least once and usually repeatedly. And it's critical that I understand what that means. If I understand what it means is, when he considers life under the sun, he's talking about this life, this world, what's below the sun, as opposed to what might be above, the spiritual realm. It's the view of the materialist. I think that's what he's talking about. And that's what he so oftentimes comes back to. Suppose you take the materialist view. Suppose you live the ungodly life. We know what that word ungodly means. It sounds terrible. It is terrible. But you know, an ungodly man doesn't have to be grossly immoral. He's just not godly. What does it mean to be godly? It means that I have such a reverence for God that I would not take one step without Him. Everything in my life is directed by God. The ungodly man is the opposite. An ungodly man, I think in the Bible term, might be a good neighbor. He might be kind to his dog. He might pay his bills. But I'll tell you what he doesn't do. He doesn't think about God at all. And there are just millions of folks like that. Who they marry, what job they take, what they do with their money. They never think about God. They live life under the sun. The world to them is just what they can touch and feel. That's all they consider. They think about here and now. There's a world full of folks like that. Nothing new about it. And I think Solomon, for a number of years, got away from God and began to explore this world and think just about this world. He says, if you want to find something that's empty, then just live for this life. Just set God aside. You just live for this life. What's the profit, he asked, in a life that does not put God first, that does not consider God? I'll tell you what he said. He said it's vanity. No, he said it's vanity of vanities. The word vanity just means emptiness. And vanity of vanities is that superlative that they tell me in Hebrew involves just repeating the word. Just like in the tabernacle, for example, you have the holy place and then you have the most holy place, or literally the holy, holy place. And God in Isaiah is holy, holy, holy. Well, here we have vanity of vanities. There's nothing more useless, nothing more empty and unsatisfying. There's no greater loss than a life that's just lived under the sun. That, I think, is what Ecclesiastes is intended to teach us. As one of the modern speech paraphrases puts it, you spend your life working and laboring, and what do you have to show for it? Now, here's the trick. You know, you can spend years trying to ignore that and distract yourself, but at some point, it's going to break on us. What's it all been for? A guy named Walter Kaiser wrote a little book on Ecclesiastes, and I thought this paragraph was worth repeating. He wrote this, by the way, in the 1970s. It's 50 years old, still true. He talks about how as he turns away from God, man is gripped by an inexplicable loneliness. Is there no one home in the universe? Perhaps there's life on other planets. You know, I think that's where a lot of that comes from, by the way. We're looking for intelligence, as one fellow said, in the universe because we can't find any on earth. And I think that's about the way it is. You know, people are looking for something. You know, we've jettisoned God out of our lives. Aren't we smart? And isn't it lonely? Surely if God is dead, as many theologians say, there must be someone or something there. There has to be, or we're stuck. But no, the agony, the dread, the nothingness, and the boredom are worse than anyone had imagined. Truth continues to disappear in direct proportion to the disappearance of God from modern thought. All is relative is the only absolute left. So Solomon starts this book off by talking to us about the emptiness of life under the sun. And we remember the words. They are memorable. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What profit hath the man of all his labor which he takes under the sun? Verse 4 of chapter 1, if you're reading with me. One generation passes away, and another generation comes, but the earth abides forever. The sun also arises, and the sun goes down, and hastens to his place where he arose. The wind goes toward the south, returns to the north, whirls about continually. The wind returns again according to his circuits. The rivers run into the sea, yet the sea is not full. Unto the place from whence the rivers come, thither they return. Earth, wind, fire, and water. You know, you never run out of wind, never run out of water. I mean, you might have too much over here and too little over here, but it all balances out. Yeah, the sun continues to shine in the sky. I always think about that story that I heard. Maybe you've heard it too. I assume it's apocryphal. It may not be. There was a lady who went to hear a lecture by the local astronomy professor at the school. And he was talking about the sun. And he went on for several minutes about the sun. The sun is a star, has finite amount of fuel. And he said in 10 billion years, the sun will burn out. And this greatly disturbed the lady. And she, after the lecture, caught the guy. And she said, listen, I need to know, did you say that that the sun would burn out in 10 billion years or 10 million years? And he said 10 billion. She said, oh, I'm so glad. I thought you said 10 million. She said, You know, we got one sun. It's the same sun that the apostles saw in the sky. Probably you think about that once in a while, don't you? When you go outside, you see the sunshine. It's the same sun. Same sun that Noah saw, same sun that Adam saw. Just had the one. It keeps on going and the world keeps on turning. You know what doesn't keep on? You and me. And that's what he says in verse 4. He says, people come and go. The world never changes, but the people come and go. Can I tell you something? When you get to be my age, I might be the oldest guy here. I'm sure not the youngest guy here. But I can promise you think about that. And you start realizing that you don't really need any 20-year plans anymore. And one of these days plans. And you start getting your priorities lined up. But here's a fact. You might be here. You know, there are young folks who don't make 30. They don't make 20. I'm not trying to scare you. I'm just talking real. But one thing I'm sure of is that none of us get out of this world alive, as the old saying goes. And the cemeteries are full. And when you get to this point in life, you look back and you think, 1978, was that long ago? Yeah, it sure was. So, as we try to deal with that, you know, it does jolt our system a bit as we consider the fragility and the temporary nature of life. In chapter 1 and verse 9, he adds to this thought with these words, the thing that has been is that which shall be, and the thing which is done is that which shall be done. And there's no new thing under the sun. Is there anything whereof it may be said, this is new? It hath been already, even, he says, from the beginning, the old time that was before us. You know, people sometimes will quibble with this, and they will say, well, I surely don't believe that's true. You talk about nothing new. Well, you can't believe how life has changed the last 100 years, the last 20 years. Yeah, but that's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about how the toys have changed. We're talking about serious things. I like what Brother Kaufman wrote once about this. He said, emotionally, man is exactly the same as he's always been. And the sins of America are exactly the sins of ancient Babylon. Man's basic spiritual need is the same as that of Adam and Eve after they were cast out of the garden. That's exactly right. It was the inspired man who said that there's no temptation that you will experience that has not been experienced by other humans. There's no new thing in that sense under the sun. And so there is this monotony about life, and it's the same need from one generation to the next. And then verse 11, where he says, there is no remembrance of former things, and neither shall there be any remembrance of things which are to come, with those which shall come after. And there are some who connect that with the previous verse, and they simply see in that the idea that, well, the reason why things seem new is because people just forget so easy, and maybe there's a point there. But I think he may be talking about something more than that. I think there's something to be said about the fact that life is so transient and so quickly forgotten. Our existence is. There's a cemetery down in Clay County, Alabama. Every state's got a Clay County. There's a Clay County, Alabama. And that's where my mother and my father's families were from. I never lived there. And there's a cemetery which contains a lot of our relatives. And I don't go there often, but if I'm down that way, I'll go by and I'll find maybe somebody new. And I'll see a name on a tombstone, and I don't know who that is. I never met them. I was one of these guys that came along late in life. My dad was about 40 when I was born. And so one of the effects of that is you don't meet a lot of your kinfolks. So, you know, my sister, who was older than I am, got to know grandparents and some great-grand. I didn't get to know those folks. So I'm at the cemetery, and I'm looking, and I think, I know that guy's kin to me. I can see his name. I don't know the man. He's kin to me, but I don't know him. Even if I knew a little bit about him, I wouldn't know him as a person. Died years before I was born. Isn't it amazing how a human life can disappear in such a short time? Here's something I need to think about. Not going to be that long. My name's going to be on a tombstone if the Lord doesn't come back first. And guess what? People are going to come by so many years from now, and they're going to say, Wes Brown, what was that? I don't know. I don't know. He might have been kin to me. They've been forgotten, will be forgotten. It's the nature of life under the sun. And I tell you, for most people, any thinking person, that works on you. There's something about that unsettling and unsatisfying. And we begin to ask questions like, is this all there is? That's not accidental. And in 113, Solomon wrote, I gave my heart to seek and to search out by wisdom concerning all things that are done under the sun. This sore travail hath God given to the sons of man to be exercised therewith. This struggle we're talking about trying to find meaning in life. And by the way, if you're here tonight and you're so young you hadn't faced this yet, if you live long enough, you will. I promise you. It's a very human thing that you wake up one day and you think, is this all there is to life? The Lexham version, another version says, it's a grievous task that God has given to humans. I think that's the thought. It's a particularly human problem. I've said before, you know, guinea pigs and house cats don't have midlife crises. You ever notice that? They're just not made that way. But because we are made in the image of God, there's something about the temporary nature of this life that's unsettling, and we seek something greater, something truer. And again, that's not an accident. In 3:11, there's this great passage here where Solomon points out that God has placed eternity, olam, in the heart of man. And that word suggests the idea of that which is beyond sight. One translator said, or one lexicographer said, it was like a vanishing point. It's this idea of that which is endless and beyond. And God made man with olam, eternity in his heart. We are made to struggle against that which is temporary and long for that which is eternal. And I believe God gave us that so that we might seek Him. That we might look at this life and long to find our Creator. We might, as Paul would later say, seek after Him and find Him, though He's not far from every one of us. I think it's the same thing that Solomon's talking about. But I tell you, the condemnation of men is they decide that instead of looking up, they're going to find their own way to fill the emptiness inside them. And so Ecclesiastes has a lot to say, I think, about taking the wrong road and trying to find at least fulfillment in the wrong places. If you look with me in chapter 1, we noticed a moment ago how that Solomon gave his heart to seek and to search out by wisdom. And in verse 16, I commune with mine own heart, saying, Lo, I have come to great estate and have gotten more wisdom than all that have been before me in Jerusalem. Yea, my heart had great experience of wisdom. I gave my heart to know wisdom and madness and folly. What that tells me is that wisdom, as he is talking about here, is not the wisdom of God. It's not that wisdom we looked at in Proverbs. But the wisdom he's talking about here is an alternative route to God, look to happiness, I should say. Just like madness and folly. He's looking for something to fulfill him and to make his life somehow make sense. He's walking away from God and he seeks wisdom, the wisdom of this world, the wisdom of man. Solomon had a lot of wisdom. He certainly was a brilliant fellow. And he was highly educated, and he was an expert in many subjects, and people had come from all over the world to hear him lecture about all kinds of things. There are people today who think that the key to happiness and fulfillment is if we just get all the brilliant folks together. We don't need God. We can make our own way. That's a very modern idea. The American Humanist Association, every time I see their logo, I just almost chuckle. It's not funny. But they say, good without God. Good without God. What a nonsense statement that is. Let me tell you, without God, you don't know what good means. Good is a nonsense word. Ought is a nonsense word. Righteousness is a nonsense. Wrong is a nonsense word. Because if there is no God, then who knows what right means? You mean you don't like something? You do like something? Well, that's your opinion. But to say somebody ought not to do something, that something is wrong, suggests there is a higher standard than me and you we're appealing to. But there is nothing higher. If there is no God, if life under the sun is all there is, and that seeming contradiction just seems to get by these folks. Secular humanism is a non-religious worldview rooted in science, naturalistic philosophy, and human ethics rather than faith and doctrine and mysticism. By the way, these folks talk about faith as if it's a bad word. Nobody's got more faith than an atheist. In fact, one of my favorite books on evidences is a book that's entitled, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. You're telling me that there's a creation without a creator? Man, I don't think I can buy that one. But anyway, they talk about providing solutions to human problems. And how are we going to do that? With our own smarts. This fellow is Stephen Jay Gould. I think he's dead now. But he, for a time, was sort of a TV celebrity. He was a paleontologist. I think he for years was associated with Harvard University, brilliant fellow, an atheist, a secular humanist. And he was asked to contribute a piece to something that Time magazine was doing a few years ago on the meaning of life. And so Mr. Gould offered an article he entitled, "The Meaning of Life in an Evolved World." And he explains, I think, what he means by evolved as you look at this little excerpt. He said, "We are here," talking about man, humanity. "We're here because one odd group of fishes had a peculiar fin anatomy that could transform into legs for terrestrial creatures. We're here because the earth never froze entirely during an ice age, because a small and tenuous species arising in Africa 250,000 years ago has managed so far to survive by hook and by crook." That's his view. By the way, please don't ask him questions like, "Where did these fish come from?" Those are rude questions. Let's just go with the flow here. Yeah, there were fish, and then they evolved, and then dinosaurs. He said, "We may yearn for a higher answer, but none exist. This explanation, though superficially troubling, and if not terrifying, is ultimately liberating and exhilarating. We cannot read the meaning of life passively in the facts of nature. We must construct these answers for ourselves, from our own wisdom and ethical sense. There is no other way." If you're following along with what he's saying, let me tell you, those are, to me, very chilling words. We can jettison God, and we can make our own morality with our own smarts, with our own ethical sense and wisdom. I find it particularly interesting that a fellow like Mr. Gould, who was of Jewish heritage, would think, yeah, this is a good idea. What's the worst that could happen? You ever been to the Holocaust Museum in Washington? Some of you may have. One of the exhibits that you can't forget is they have just a whole wall full of shoes. Now, where are the shoes from? These are the shoes that were taken from or put off of the people who went into the showers, the Jews who were the victims, who eventually, of course, it was really a gas chamber, and they were killed and then burned in the incinerator. Their bodies were. Millions died that way. Millions by people who thought they were going to make a better society based on their own morals and their own wisdom and their own smarts. Made sense to them. We studied in school the French Revolution and the Terror and all the people that were guillotined. I tell you, man, that's like a tea party compared to these three jokers. Mao, Stalin, Lenin, they killed people by the tens of millions and never even broke a sweat because they thought, well, these people are worthless and we're making a new society. And if a few million people have to be killed or several million have to be killed, why, it's well worth it. We're working on our own smarts here. God forbid. This fellow's not a mass murderer. He's an author. He was. His name is H.G. Wells. Some of you guys may have read his stuff. He's a fiction writer for the most part, also a British atheist intellectual. Mr. Wells wrote books like The Time Machine and War of the Worlds. Not really my cup of tea. But anyway, still very popular, made movies out of him and so on. But he was a British secular humanist. And in the early part of the 20th century, he was one of the intellectuals. A lot of people had this idea in America and in England that just right after the First World War, that now's the time to make over the world, come together in one nation, a new world order. Does that sound familiar? And we will together build a new society, a heaven on earth. This book, Outline of History, is not a fiction, strictly. It's supposed to be a history. It's about 1,000 pages of the history of mankind. And then in the last chapter, a chapter that he calls the next stage of history. He writes about how he sees the next few years. Now again, you've got to remember, this was written in 1920. If you have an idea of American history, world history, the World War I, we called it, the Great War, they called it, began in 1914 to 1918. And a couple of years later, Mr. Wells writes this very optimistic book. The Great War, 1914 to 1918, was the culmination of the military energy of the Western populations. And they fought and fought well because they believed that they were fighting, quote, the war to end all wars. They were, he says. Our world is very weak and feeble still, but its war fever is over. Its temperature is, if anything, subnormal. It is doubtful that it will take the fever again for a long time. And 20 years later, they were in World War II, and 85 million people, by some accounts, died in that conflict. Mr. Wells did not see the future that way. As a good secular humanist, he was sure that good times were ahead. And he writes here, I'm not giving a book report, but I just think it's interesting. He says, the old civilization created tradition, lived by tradition. Today, the power of tradition is destroyed. We don't need that anymore. There are unhopeful prophets who see in the gathering together of men into one community the possibility of violent race conflicts, conflicts of ascendancy. But that's to suppose that civilization is incapable of adjustment. We know enough today to know that there is infinite room for betterment in every human concern. Nothing is needed but collective effort. Our poverty, our restraints, our infections, our indigestions, our quarrels, and our misunderstandings are all things controllable and removable by concerted human action. So Mr. Wells said in 1920. And then World War II broke out. And the atomic age. And all of the things that went on. Now, Mr. Wells died in 1946. He lived to see all of that. And in his old age, he wrote several essays. And they don't have any of the optimism of his earlier years. He is a broken old man who is disillusioned. And he wrote an essay called Mind at the End of Its Tether, and it was published after his death. And here's a little portion of it. See if you can tell a difference. Mr. Wells wrote, our universe is not merely bankrupt. There remains no dividend at all. After all, the present writer has no compelling argument to convince the reader that he should not be cruel or mean or cowardly. He'd rather our species ended its story in dignity and kindness and generosity, and not like drunken coward or in a daze or poisoned rats in a sack. But this is a matter of individual predilection for everyone to decide for himself. What did they say? Good without God? Isn't that what they said? The reason why I give you a 100-year-old example is because we have here the whole story, and you can see the disillusionment of the whole thing. And this is how the story ends every time. We got the same folks, or different folks today saying the same thing. I can promise you this, if the world stands, it'll end the same way. Solomon knew that. Solomon talked about how that wisdom doesn't make you happy. In fact, the more you know, the more you hurt. It's not the answer. I'll tell you something else. Not only does human wisdom, secular humanism, lead to despair, it also leads to degradation. This philosophy degrades man. And I think that's exactly what Solomon was writing about in in Ecclesiastes chapter 3 and verse 18. This passage sometimes seems mystifying to some. But notice Solomon writes, I said in mine heart with regard to the children of man that God is testing them, that he may see that they are themselves but beasts. For what happens to the children of man and what happens to the beast is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. They all have the same breath. And man has no advantage over beasts, for all is vanity. All go to one place. All are from the dust, to the dust all return, and who knows whether the spirit of man goes upward or the spirit of the beast goes downward. And, of course, the witnesses have camped on this passage, and other religious materialists and others have said, well, does the Bible teach that there is nothing to man but body and breath? Is that what? No. In fact, the Bible teaches that man is made in the image of God and after His likeness. Different from the animals. Man is made after His image, and man will live on. Man is elevated by his relationship with God. But suppose there is no God. We've jettisoned God, remember. We're just about what's under the sun. And what Solomon's saying here is this truth, that if there is no God, then we are just another animal. As he said, they have one breath, they both die, both go back to the dust, and who knows what happens after that. Life under the sun. If that's all there is, that's what we are. And do you know that in our society, now more than ever, we have men who are so opposed to bowing the knee to God that they accept being an animal. I was in Washington a few years ago. This is the Smithsonian Institute of Natural History. And I and my family went there. I did not want to go. It just so happened that we had a few minutes and we were standing in front of the place. I tell you, I didn't want to go, not because it's not a beautiful building and not because there are not interesting exhibits there. I didn't want to go because I knew what I'd find in there, which was this heavy-handed, atheistic, humanistic interpretation of everything. Our ape heritage. Thanks. My self-esteem needed boosting today. I'm glad to know our ape heritage. It gets worse. And then I see this on the wall. Well, we must be, or at least have a common ancestors with ape. Look, we both got elbows. It's degrading. It's insulting. And then to prove their point, they said, think about how you're related to other things. The pictures are awful here. Again, I didn't want to be there. And also, I'm not a photographer, and I had a camera phone, so please forgive that. But once I got there, I said, I've got to take a picture of this. Because what this is intended to do is to show how genetically similar you are. For example, did you know that you are 98.8% genetically similar to a chimpanzee? Did you know that? Did you know that you're 93% genetically similar to a rhesus monkey? Well, obviously then, we must have a common ancestor. And we all must be related, and we all must be the same. And then I looked at the other side of this same thing in their building. And it said that we are 75% genetically similar to a chicken. And that we're 60% genetically similar to a banana tree. I don't know if a banana tree is in my family or not. I sort of lost the plot at that point. But to me, you and I would look at that and say, okay, I believe that. You know what that says to me? That the God who made us out of the same stuff. But He made man in His own image. And these folks say, well, this just proves that there is no God somehow, or it fits that idea. That's what Mr. Darwin thought. He once famously wrote that man in his arrogance thinks himself a great work, worthy of the interposition of a deity. More humble, I think, and truer to consider him created from animals. And I want you to understand that these materialists do think that it's too much to think that we could be in the image of God. That's too high. We're much, much lower than that. When I say it's a degrading point of view, I mean exactly what I said. And they tell you that over and over again. We are made or created from animals. A few years ago, there was a book written by a guy named James Rachels. When I was a freshman at Alabama, at the University in Birmingham, Dr. Rachels was the chair of the philosophy department. He became a world-known expert in and advocate of what came to be known as animal rights. And he wrote this book, and he borrowed Darwin's title. He said, created from animals, and then the subtitle is, the moral implications of Darwinism. Now, Dr. Rachels was, he's dead now, but he was a Darwinist. And what this book does is it says, look, we've been saying for years, no God, don't care about God, that we just have evolved with these other animals and we're all in the same family. He said, if that's so, we need to start acting like it. And so he writes some rather provocative things in this book. Early in the book he writes, human life, if we accept the view of Darwin, which they all do, human life will no longer be regarded with any kind of superstitious awe which is accorded to it in traditional thought. Man made in the image of God. And the lives of non-humans will no longer be a matter of indifference. This means that human life will, in a sense, be devalued. That's what I thought you were saying. While the value granted to non-human life will be increased. A revised view of how we should treat animals will result reconstructing morality without assumption of man's specialness. Toward the end of the book, he writes, therefore, any adequate defense of human dignity would require some conception of human beings as radically different from animals. But that's precisely what evolutionary theory calls into question. We're not different from the animals, he says. That's what Darwinism teaches. It makes us suspicious of any doctrine that sees large gaps of any sort between humans and all other creatures. Think about that sentence. There cannot be any large gap between you and any other creature. That's a pretty broad category. This being so, a Darwinian may conclude that a successful defense of human dignity is most unlikely. And you think, well, these guys are just a bunch of theorists, and maybe they're overstating the case. They don't really believe that. They believe that. Here's another guy, Peter Singer. You may not know him. I think he's still living. He was a philosopher, taught at Princeton University. All these guys are brilliant people, by the way. They wouldn't let me cut the grass at Princeton. These guys are all smart guys. I'm not trying to compare IQs with them. I'm just saying, I don't care how smart they are, they're talking nonsense. And I know why. Because when you take God out of the picture, nothing makes sense. And so, Peter Singer writes, human babies are not born self-aware or capable of grasping that they exist over time. They're not persons. If a fetus does not have the same claim to life as a person, they already assume abortion is a glory. Well, if you kill an unborn child, by the way, this was written 30 years ago, 40 years ago. Now, we got politicians that say amen. If a fetus does not have the same claim to life as a person, it appears that newborn baby does not either. And the life of a newborn is of less value than the life of a pig or a dog or a chimpanzee. At least you can get some work out of a dog. Well, I'll tell you, this may insult you, and it ought to, I guess. But there is a devilish logic to this. It all goes back to the fact that when you jettison God and we look at life under the sun, that's all we see. Solomon said 3,000 years ago, tell you what where that places you. It places you right with the animals. This is a book, Moral Problems. And this is actually my textbook. I know you care. You probably expected a papyri scroll, but no. But this is my textbook from my freshman year, my first quarter in school. I had signed up for a Philosophy 101 class, and I am just, as the guy said, I'm just off the bus from Bumpkinville, and I have no idea what I'm in for. And I sit down with my textbook, and they start lecturing us on moral problems. And they go over things like the morality and rationality of suicide. And they're talking about a defense of abortion, and they're talking about animal liberation. I never heard that term before. This is 1979. And this is just the last few sentences of our friend Mr. Singer's essay on that subject that they were teaching, not in Berkeley, in Birmingham. He admits as he concludes, "Nor have I considered all the detailed questions that need to be asked once we start thinking about other species in radically different ways presented by this book." Same thing. If we accept Darwinism, then what we have to do is recognize that we can't think about species radically different, and so we all have to deal with some specific questions. What, for instance, are we to do about the genuine conflicts of interest like rats biting slum children? Now, I'm not sure of the answer, but it's an essential point for us just to understand that we do see it as conflicts of interest, that we have to recognize that the rats have interest too. And I thought, this guy cannot be serious. Oh, he's deadly serious. Now, how do smart people get so far off base? Life under the sun. That's all we need. That's all we have. That's all there is. Now, you can accept that idea. But when you do, not only will you find disappointment, as Mr. Wells' example teaches us, but you will find a very degraded state. This is a quotation again from Brother Kaufman's commentary, I think. And this is written 30 years ago, but this sounds very recent, doesn't it? If our grossly wicked society really wants the explanation of the irresistible tidal wave of violent crimes which are destroying our cities and threatening the collapse of civilization itself, they must find it in this very conception, that there is no God and that man is merely an animal. That's exactly right. There is only one reason why it's wrong for one man to kill another. And that reason is that every man is created in the image of God, and his destruction is against God Himself. A godless society has no more rights than a society of brown rats. I don't know if you'd read Dr. Singer's work or not, but that seems very appropriate, doesn't it? That's exactly right. Will Durant wrote 10 or 12 volumes of the history of man, and you may have seen them. If you hadn't read them, you've probably seen them. I think he was at Columbia for years. Anyway, he wrote, after all those big volumes, he wrote a little book he called The Lessons of History. And I thought it was very interesting in that book that he included this point. He said, there is no significant example in history, after all his study, there's no significant example in history of a society successfully maintaining a moral life without the aid of religion. Now, this guy's no Bible thumper, but I tell you what he knows. He knows ain't no such thing as good without God. And it's 8 o'clock. And that's point one. So I'm probably just going to have mercy on you and quit. That's the problem. I told somebody the other day, I said, I can't tell you what little I know about Ecclesiastes in 2 lessons. But my advantage is this ain't your first rodeo, and many of you have been through these books and you've heard able teachers teach them. But my point tonight is, and there are probably 6 or 7 dead ends that Solomon looks at. He talks about the dangers and the disaster of hedonism. You can give yourself to pleasure, and that's empty. And you can give to drunkenness and such pleasures, sexual pleasures. You can give yourself to materialism, and you can try to heap up all that you can get. You can try to fight the social justice battle and make a heaven on earth. Or false religion, what he called the sacrifice of a fool. There are all kinds of dead-end roads. And at the end of them, I'll tell you what you'll find. You'll find disappointment. And he said, you know how I know that? Because I tried them. And I'm trying to help you understand that if you just hold to God, you can avoid so much heartache and so much trouble. So, tomorrow night, Lord willing, we want to present another lesson from Ecclesiastes, but maybe a little different, slightly different tenor. It's not my favorite book on Ecclesiastes, but it's my favorite title of a book on Ecclesiastes. I got a book in my library, and it's called The Art of Staying Off Dead-End Streets. Yeah. But the problem is, I don't think that's the whole message of Ecclesiastes. I think that's just part of it. I think a lot of it is, this doesn't work, and this doesn't work, and I tried this, and it doesn't work. But there's also a good bit of information here about what is necessary, and what will work, and what is essential to leading a life of satisfaction and joy and meaning. And so I think tomorrow night we want to try to talk about that, if we can. And I so much appreciate your kind attention this week and your kind attention tonight. All right. We're going to sing a song, and we're going to encourage those who maybe have not yet obeyed the gospel to come and confess Jesus as Lord, to come and to be baptized into Christ based upon your repentance, based upon your confession of Jesus, baptized for remission of sins and raised to walk in newness of life. You know, rejecting God's a dead end. And it only gets worse. You can distract yourself for a while. You can stay drunk for a while. Or you can play for a while. But at some point, and I promise you this is so, if you live long enough, you're going to come to realize how empty it all is. It's better to go to the house of mourning than the house of feasting. For that's the end of all men. And the living will lay it to his heart. Sorrow is better than laughter. Because we need to think about things that are real. If you have come to that realization and you desire to be a child of God, we'd be glad to help you tonight. If you're one who, as a child of God, lost your way and you've strayed from the path, the Lord longs to receive you back. And we'd be glad to help you come back to Him if we can. Please let us know how we might assist you. Right now, while we stand and sing, will you please come?